day, welcome to the weekly wrap from Rand Swiss. Obviously, the news that dominated the week was the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. We had talked about this a number of times in the past. I personally had assumed that Russia was going to invade, but only the eastern end of the Ukraine. Was quite surprised actually when they did this all-out battle against the whole country. The Ukraine is not a small country; it's about 40 million people or so. It's a substantial country. It may not have nuclear weapons, but it certainly does not have no defenses, especially when you consider the fact that they've been getting some arms, especially some sophisticated arms from the US and from other Western powers. So it is a bit of a surprise that this has occurred, but we can't really go into the geopolitics of every single situation. What we really want to be looking at is what it's going to do to your investment outlook and your investment decisions going forward from here. So let's just talk about what's happening in the Ukraine and why it might be part of something bigger over the long term. So the Ukraine basically is currently being invaded by the Russians. There are hundreds of thousands of troops possibly Russian troops on the ground. We're talking about millions of people basically fleeing the country, especially women and children, to neighboring places like Poland and so on. We are talking about missiles firing into cities, airports being sieged, planes being shot down, military planes, tanks in the streets, that kind of stuff. The question is, what is the purpose of this and why is Russia doing it? Russia basically, essentially, what it says, according to a speech by Vladimir Putin, is doing it for a couple of reasons. One of them is to prevent NATO from getting into Ukraine, and also apparently it's to remove Nazis from the Ukraine. It's kind of a strange thing because the president of the Ukraine is actually Jewish, so it's a Jewish Nazi situation that apparently the Russians are afraid of. No, it's ridiculous. Anyway, so the Russians are doing this. The impact has been quite mixed. We have seen, for instance, oil prices rise sharply, broke $100 a barrel. We saw initially yesterday, this was Thursday basically, the stock market in the US opened significantly lower before ending the day positive. And we're going to talk about why that ended the day positive and why it does make sense. So this is it. The Russians are invading the Ukraine. If you look at it as a part of a pattern, you could argue that what happened to the Americans in Afghanistan, where the Americans went in, they eventually basically left after a couple of decades. The Taliban have taken back that country, and it looked, except for a 2-decade period, like it was all a wasted measure. Trillions, in fact, of wasted, money. Thousands of dead Americans, and maybe more than 100 times as many dead Afghanis. You're talking about a huge, loss of the US, and it seemed to show to the Russians, according to some people, that the Americans were not, as firm as they used to be. And it's the Americans that matter in NATO. Yes, NATO is the North American Treaty Organization. Basically, it's meant to be, the Americans and the Western Europeans and the Turks against the Soviet Union. Since that point in time, since the Soviet Union fell, we now have had some of the Eastern European countries that were part of the Soviet Union joining NATO. And that was, of course, the reason that we had this whole issue. But still, even though there's other countries there, it's almost like entirely an American-driven kind of thing. The Americans have a lot of power in there, especially because of the fact that the Western Europeans have not spent much money on armaments for the longest time. They basically just relied on the Americans to protect them. So the Americans, they show weakness. The Russians are more comfortable taking on NATO, or taking on the anger of NATO. And the next domino in this scenario to fall is Afghanistan, is the Ukraine. The next domino to possibly fall would be Taiwan. The Chinese believe Taiwan is a part of China. They believe it's a breakaway province, and basically any person, any country that mentions that Taiwan's a country is going to face some kind of backlash from the Chinese. So if you look out there, if you have seen this yet, I think last year John Cena, the wrestler, mentioned that his movie is going to be released. One of the first countries going to be released in is going to be Taiwan. The fact that he said country and Taiwan together caused a huge backlash in China, and he had to go in and apologize to the Chinese people in Mandarin. So that shows you that he does have bilingual abilities in Mandarin at the very least. But also, it's quite shocking that you would not think that that would be the strength of the Chinese powers. I mean, you can see the Chinese powers coming through in a number of different areas. I mean, somebody recently mentioned the fact that Richard Gere, the guy from Pretty Woman, from Officer and Gentleman, and so on, big movie star in the 1980s and 1990s, is basically disappeared. You don't see Richard Gere anyway. The reason being is that he's pro-Tibet, he's been anti-China, and the Chinese say basically, if Richard Gere is in a movie, not only will that movie not appear in China, your movies may not appear in China. And if you play something like Disney or something like Sony, your theme parks won't appear in China. Some other business you do in China won't be done. So they've used that to basically blacklist it. Now, if the Chinese see that the Americans in the West let Russia invade Ukraine without too much actual military backlash, them invading Taiwan is probably quite likely. It means a lot to them to invade Taiwan. It means a lot for them for Taiwan to be part of China. It's not a small thing. It's something that's like I said, they've used pressure on movies, they've used pressure on companies, they've used pressure on countries to not recognize Taiwan as a country. So if, like I said, I think if the Russians get by with this, Taiwan's next. If Taiwan's next, we are likely to see a huge impact on the global economy and a huge impact on effectively a new Cold War. You're going to have an axis of China, Russia, and a couple other countries in Eastern Europe and say some parts of Asia, for instance, places like Pakistan, maybe. Iran might be included in that. Maybe even something like Myanmar. You could be seeing places like Venezuela and Cuba. We're talking about a new kind of like split in the world. It wouldn't be a 50-50 split. Still be the majority of people would probably be involved, or the majority of the economy, let me say rather, would probably be on the side of the NATO parties. But it would be a substantial thing. It would probably be even bigger than the Soviet Union was in the Cold War in relative size. One of the big parties here is India. India at the moment is not taking sides in this particular conflict. They may not take sides right now, but if the Chinese do have aspirations towards Taiwan, many people do not know this, but actually India has been at war with China a number of times. In fact, just a year or so ago, Indian soldiers were killed by Chinese soldiers in a border dispute. So there is a lot of tension between the two, and Pakistan to a certain extent is almost a vassal state of the Chinese, and to a certain extent also we are seeing that happening in Sri Lanka as well, which is the south of India. So we are seeing if this does occur, we might see India shift over from being more of a neutral party to being more of a NATO kind of allied party. But you still are going to see a gigantic shift. You're going to have places as large as Russia, China, Pakistan. We're talking, of course, huge numbers of people, and maybe even places like Venezuela. Who knows, some of the Gulf states might want to switch over, so who knows what happens there. But definitely places like Iran might be more keen on that. Places that have experienced sanctions like Myanmar, Ethiopia might be also a player in this particular kind of thing, because Ethiopia, has some tensions that the Chinese have supported there. The Chinese have been really influential in a number of troubled countries in Africa, so it might be a new a line there. So this is something that could really change the globe going forward, especially, like I said, if the Russians get away with this. If the Russians are able to do this and get away with what is seen to be an acceptable price paid, this is something that will probably spread onto China and Taiwan as well. Now, beyond the geopolitical stuff, we also have to say there's also impact on the commodity markets. Russia is a huge exporter of oil, the natural gas, massive amounts of energy exports to Western Europe. Oil prices therefore rose, but also other commodities as well. Because the Ukraine is also under invasion at the moment, the Ukraine's resources are also probably going to be off the market for a little while. Massive exporter of iron ore, titanium, of food products, for instance. They are one of the biggest food producers in the world. So we're talking a gigantic impact on the global economy. One thing to be worried about, especially us in South Africa, is not just the oil, but it's also nitrogen. Apparently a lot of nitrogen facilities are affected by this kind of stuff, and we could see some fertilizer prices, because Belarus as well with the potash stuff, that could also be affected. So we could see fertilizer prices rise. If fertilizer prices rise, that'll feed through farmers' prices and feed through food prices on your table. And so you're going to be seeing possibly an increase in price of food as well coming through just because of this. Now, with all the negative, there's some positives as well for the market at least. Of course, it doesn't compare. I'm not saying that people's lives compare to money, but this is just one negative for the market, one positive for the market. Interest rates are probably not going to be rising anywhere near as much as people have been thinking about. I mean, if you look back a month ago, even a few weeks ago, you had JP Morgan and other major banks come out and talk about 6, 7, maybe something 9 consecutive interest rate strikes in the US. You're talking about a huge uptick in interest rates in the US. That's almost certainly at least delayed. We're not going to see probably a hike come through in March, as we've been expecting from the US. And that's going to mean that the market's going to have a little more leeway to basically run. We are assuming, of course, that the situation doesn't just immediately resolve itself and disappear, which I don't think is possible. There's still going to be some fear in March, and therefore I think the Federal Reserve is not going to be as keen to raise rates. At the same time, the stuff that's happening here is going to be quite bad for inflation. Now, if you don't keep interest rates higher or don't move interest rates a little higher, and inflation really does take off, because you're talking about a situation with oil, we're talking about the situation with agricultural products, we're talking about the situation with other raw materials, because these two countries, Russia and Ukraine, are both going to be probably excluded from most of the international markets for these commodities. The Russians due to sanctions, and the Ukraine due to, of course, the war happening. It does mean that we are probably going to see inflation also under pressure, also rising basically. So high inflation, low interest rates, that's not a good overall environment to be working in. And also in terms of just what's happening right now, like I mentioned before, the Americans are really the driving force in NATO. They outspend, not just in terms of absolute terms, of course they're bigger than anyone else, but this is outspending percentages as well. They put a bigger percentage of their money, of the GDP, towards military than almost any other NATO power. That was going to change in all likelihood. The Germans are definitely going to change. And if you look at anywhere in history, if the Germans start arming up, it's not a good sign. We are probably going to see almost all of NATO adding significant amounts to the defense spending over the next year or plus, maybe a couple of years going forward. This is going to be a huge windfall for especially American armor makers, but the French as well also make arms, the Germans make as well. So I think we are going to see a lot of money going towards these arms manufacturers globally, and not just because of the usual customers, like for instance the US and so on, places like China, India and so on, but because Western Europe, which has a lot of money, is going to come into play in a really big way and really start buying a lot of arms from these places. It's going to be a step shift, I think, when it comes to some of these big companies, Lockheed Martin and so on, is already going to be doing very well going forward. Okay, so that's basically the war edition of the weekly wrap from Ransomus, and I'll speak to you guys again next week. Thank you.